Okay, now we're going to get rolling with the actual course content for our course. So everything in this video is drawn from the assigned readings for this module. So we're talking about universities as organizations. So first, want to answer the question, what are the features of an organization? Well, an organization can be defined by there being a clear division of work, that there's some coordination of effort, and that ideally that coordination reflects some sort of strategic planning or strategic thinking, that an organization is made up of multiple people, and there are some sort of common objectives that are being worked toward, and that the common objectives are being worked toward within a coordinated system that is managed. So if we think about colleges and universities as organizations, what are those distinguishing features? And I think that this is one of these things that we're going to be uncovering and discovering as we go throughout this course. So I'm not providing a laundry list of answers to this question right now. This is something that I want you to think about. You'll see things related to this question in some of the discussion posts this summer in the course. Now, this question is maybe not directly asked in any of those discussion forums, but it's something to think about as we go through the course. So as we go through the course, I think there are some common characteristics that you're going to see as it relates to organizations, but really when we think about institutions of higher learning as organizations. First is that organizations are incredibly complex. Just when we get our bearings and get our perception figured out, and we try to look at another part and it's all upside down, or we're confused by an optical illusion. So organizations are, by their very definition, complex. Organizations are surprising. And I use this term, and we see it in the readings for this week, because in many ways, organizations don't seem to follow logic. Sometimes we think that because organizations are so complex that they're going to follow a certain pattern of behaviors, but more often than not, we become confused or surprised by what organizations do. And maybe that's because organizations are deceptive. There are certainly critiques of organizations from any number of philosophical slants that we could say, okay, well, any organization is going to, by its very nature, be deceptive because an organization has to rely on deception in order to be sustainable. And I'm not going to go that far with making this point, but there's certainly things that organizations do or things that are done to organizations that certainly seem deceptive at times. And maybe it's because organizations are ambiguous. It kind of goes back to the point about organizations being complex. That we look at an organization and we think we've got a clear sense of it, but there's something about it that is unclear. There's something about it that is just a little bit confusing. And so as we talk about organizations, what we're really talking about is a series. An organization reflects a series of arranged systems. And according to Mintzberg, there are 5 basic parts. And so there's the operating core, and those are the things that are central and really the baseline of the mission of the organization. The strategic apex represents those who are setting the strategic direction for the institution. The middle line is those who help interpret the directives from the strategic apex to the operating core. The technostructure represents those who gather and analyze information about performance of the organization. And support staff are those who provide indirect support to the rest of the organization. So if we think about this in terms of post-secondary education, the operating core would be the faculty. Now, sometimes folks who are studying post-secondary education or are in administrative positions in post-secondary institutions take umbrage with that statement, but it's a simple fact. And as you all know, I am a former student affairs person, and so my identity for a long time, well, for a little while anyway, was very much focused on students out of class experiences. So to think that my experiences were not part of the operating core, that can certainly make someone be a little bit prickly. But the point is that without faculty, there really wouldn't be an institution. I have a colleague named Michael Harris who's at Southern Methodist University, and he likes to make this point about faculty being the operating core. And he said, even without students, so somebody might say, oh, well, what about students? Aren't students the core of the institution? Philosophically, sure, we might say that. And definitely from a marketing perspective, we say that students are the center of everything that we do. But what Michael likes to say is that take away students and most faculty can still conduct research. Now, for some of us whose research is based in the student experience, that would certainly be difficult. The strategic apex in a college or university would be the higher ranking administrative officers. So the president, the provost, the vice presidents, folks like that. The people who are setting the strategic agenda for the institution. The middle line, I'd interpret that as deans. Deans represent a space between faculty and administration, although they're largely at most institutions, deans are 100% administrative appointees. They may or may not teach courses. Mostly, in my experience, deans do not have a regular course load in four-year institutions, but they represent that interpreting space of interpreting what comes down from the strategic apex to the operating core. And Mintzberg makes this distinction between the technostructure and the support staff. In the context of post-secondary education, I think about pretty much all the staff outside of the operating core, the strategic apex, or the middle line of falling either within the technostructure or the support staff, depending on the nature of their positions. When we're talking about more the student affairs side, instructional support systems type of folks, they would lump into the area that Mintzberg labels as support staff. Technostructure might represent folks such as legal counsel, institutional effectiveness folks, development, those types of functions. Folks whose primary responsibility isn't in supporting what goes on in out-of-class learning, but are still quite important to the functioning of the institution. So Mintzberg talks about there being 5 structural configurations. And I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail here in terms of providing a lengthy lecture, because I actually like to think about conceptualizing post-secondary institutions based on the Birnbaum reading that we did for this week on the institutional types, rather than getting into this Mintzberg perspective. So one of the things that we do see in post-secondary education is a demarcation between centralized versus decentralized academic institutions. And there are a number of different approaches, and there's no one right way. It's not that the institution itself is centralized or decentralized, is that various functions within the institution may be centralized or decentralized. An example might be academic advising. There are some institutions where there is a central academic advising center for undergraduate students, and all undergraduate students go through that center for academic advising, particularly while they are first year or sophomore students. And then maybe once they are upper division students, their academic advising is done within the academic unit. The other approach is where all academic advising is done within academic units, regardless of classification. So that would be a decentralized approach. Another example from an instructional support system perspective might be with orientation. Now, often we think of orientation as a centralized function where there is a singular orientation office. They coordinate all new student orientation and run the entire show. Now, it's entirely possible that an institution could have a very decentralized function of structure overall, and each unit would have its own orientation program. You're probably not going to find that at large institutions, just simply because the number of students, but you could find it at smaller institutions, particularly those that have a smaller number of highly specialized academic units. So at the undergraduate level, let's say there's a smaller institution that has a distinct focus of technology. But within that, there are, just say for the sake of argument, 3 distinct approaches to technology. And each of those facilitate their own orientation process. So in one of the readings from Birnbaum, we get this idea that there are multiple systems at play within an institution, and one of the things we need to think about when talking about systems is that systems don't just operate on their own. Systems are interconnected in various ways, and one of the things that Birnbaum brings up is that systems operate in some sort of cyclical pattern, and the intersection of those cycles have impact on each of the other elements. So in this graphic, we see on the left this relationship between student enrollment, financial resources, and institutional prestige. And then on the right, institutional prestige, faculty morale, and a sense of community. So what Birnbaum suggests is that as student enrollment increases, so too do financial resources, which leads to an increase in institutional prestige, which then leads to further student enrollment, and the cycle continues that way. And then on the other side, we see that as institutional prestige increases, faculty morale increases, which leads to a greater sense of community, which leads to a greater institutional prestige. That greater institutional prestige then leads to greater student enrollment, and so on and so forth. So each of the outcomes on one element has an influence on the outcomes on another element. So one of the things that we talk about from organizational theory is the idea of tightly versus loosely coupled systems. And so when we think about tightly coupled systems, these are things where we know we've got a pretty good sense of, okay, if we do if we put this plan into place, we're going to have a desired outcome. A loosely coupled system is where we've got an idea of something that we want to do in an ideal outcome, and we're not too sure of what to actually make happen in the middle of all of that. So one of the things to look at in terms of tightly versus lightly coupled systems is think about organizations as enacting a series of decisions. So a tightly coupled system can be thought of as being deterministic, where action A leads to outcome B, and that happens every time without question. A probabilistic organizational outcome would be a loosely coupled system where there's some likelihood that if action A takes place that maybe outcome B is going to happen, and we base that on observations of other things that seem similar to this combination of action A and outcome B. So when something is deterministic, we can observe there's a direct effect. There is some sort of cause and effect that's visible. And again, though, that would be reflective of a tightly coupled system. In a probabilistic decision process or a loosely coupled system, there are moving parts that we can't readily observe, and the perception of cause and effect is obscured. So we could even have a flashback to the stats class. And so we think about a regression analysis. Now, we can't really suggest there's cause and effect, but we feel much more confident in making a suggestion of a relationship of something resulting in a desired outcome. And so we start to get towards a deterministic perspective. And then probabilistic would be a correlation. We know there's a relationship there after our analysis. We can't really pinpoint what that relationship really consists of. So if org outcomes are a lot like colleges and universities, how are we able to make sense of them as organizations? Well, maybe it comes down to a chicken and egg type of question. Which came first? Did loosely coupled systems come first due to the nature of higher ed organizations? Or it was, as we looked at in our history videos, did higher ed become so increasingly complex that it resulted in loosely coupled systems? So there's no direct answer to that. It's just something for us to ponder as we go through our course together. And so with organizations, we have to be prepared to expect the unexpected, particularly with institutions of higher education. When you look at colleges and universities, I think we expect certain structures, but sometimes there's a lot of difference among institutions. And so we look at it and we think, well, that's clearly going to be one way, but then once we slice into it, we see that it's something completely different. And that's because we expect organizations to behave in certain ways. When institutional practices don't conform to those expectations, we assume that something's gone wrong, and it's probably the leader's fault. So as I mentioned, I prefer to look at Birnbaum's models of organizational functioning in higher education rather than Mintzberg's forms of organizations. And so I'm going to just leave this on the screen for you to look at. I'm going to post the PowerPoint separate from the video, but I'm not going to read this slide to you. I'll say that in my experience and in the things that I've read as well, institutions often reflect a combination of these, and that it's more likely to be able to we're more likely to be able to condense each of these labels down to individual units on a campus. And so we might see the collegial department or the bureaucratic department, the political division, the anarchical unit. Uh, and so it's not necessarily about the entire institution. And, and that goes back to the idea that organizations and colleges and universities are, as organizations, are incredibly complex. And if we try to think about an institution as a single thing, uh, I think it can become a very naive perspective. And so we have to think about institutions as being comprised of these different elements that are all, and the elements are all ideally working toward a common goal and have distinct positions and distinct leaders. But to really understand an institution as an organization, we actually have to look at all those different pieces. And the focus of this course is looking at those different pieces through the lens of instructional support systems.